How could you sell the condo? I promised it to my wife, Devin shouted, his voice trembling with anger I had never seen before. Tasha stood behind him, crying softly, her hands pressed to her chest. But I didn't react with fear. I just took a slow breath and said calmly, "There's something else you need to know." His face changed, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally fear. For the first time in my life, I saw my son lose control. Years ago, that was me, shaking, begging, afraid. But that woman is gone now. My name is Clara May Johnson. I'm 65 years old, and for the first time, I'm not invisible anymore. After my husband Thomas passed away 7 years ago, life became silent. I lived alone in the small 2-bedroom condo we bought 30 years earlier. The walls showed age, the kitchen was small and dark, but it was mine. Every morning I brewed coffee in the same old pot, swept the floor, and stared out the window, waiting for something I couldn't name. My son Devin was all I had left. I thought after his father's death we would grow closer, but life moved him away. His work, his friends, his plans. Our calls grew shorter, his visits fewer. He'd sit on the sofa, eyes on his phone, saying he was busy. I smiled, pretending it didn't hurt, because that's what mothers do. They keep loving, even when nobody seems to see them. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, there stood Devin, my son, looking tired, holding a bouquet of flowers. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. For a moment, I forgot the distance between us. I made tea, and we sat together, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of worry he couldn't hide. After a few minutes, he said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about the condo." My heart sank. I had imagined this moment before, the day he would see this place not as a home, but as property. He talked about investments, repairs, and how it would be better for me to move somewhere smaller. I smiled and nodded, even though every word felt like a goodbye to my memories. 3 weeks passed, and every day Devin called, not to ask how I was, but to pressure me about the condo. His words grew sharper, his tone colder. "Mom, we found the perfect house, but we need that down payment. Why are you being so difficult?" And then came the text from Tasha, full of fake affection. "Mama Clara, please think about the family. Don't you want your future grandkids to have a nice home?" I read those messages in silence, my anger no longer burning hot, but steady and calm, like a storm gathering strength far out at sea. One afternoon, while I was at the bank, I overheard 2 women talking. "My mother-in-law sold her house and went traveling," one said. "She said she's worked her whole life for others. Now it's her turn to live." The other laughed and said, "That's brave. My family would never let me do that." And the first replied, "But it's her money, her life. Why should she need permission?" That sentence struck me like lightning. Why should I need permission? It was my home, my life, my decision. Devin and Tasha had contributed nothing to it. I left the bank that day feeling lighter, stronger. That evening, I contacted a real estate agent and told her I wanted to sell my condo quietly, no big ads, no fuss. A week later, I had a buyer. The sale went through faster than I imagined. I bought myself a smaller, bright apartment in a peaceful neighborhood. For the first time in years, I felt safe. I no longer waited for calls that never came. I no longer feared being alone. And as I looked out my new window, sunlight spilling across the room, I whispered to myself, I'm finally free. It had been 2 peaceful weeks in my new apartment when the storm finally arrived. My phone rang. Devin's name flashed on the screen. His voice was sharp, trembling with disbelief. "Mom, I just went by the condo. Someone else was there. What's going on?" I took a calm breath. "I sold it, Devin." There was silence, heavy and dangerous. Then he shouted, "You sold my inheritance? How could you do that?" His words cut deep, but not as deep as they once would have. "It was never your inheritance," I said softly. "It was my home, and I chose to move on." In the background, I could hear Tasha crying, her voice full of drama. "You promised it to us, Clara. You said we'd raise our kids there." But I didn't argue. I had already spent years explaining myself. This time, I didn't owe them anything. The next day, Devin showed up at my new building, angry and desperate. He banged on the door until I opened it. "Where's the money?" he demanded. "You had no right." I raised my hand and stopped him. "Enough." My voice was steady, and that surprised him. I walked to the table and placed a folder in front of him. "These are the sale papers, the receipts, and the bank statements. Everything was done legally. And if you ever question again, I'll share the recordings of our conversations, the ones where you and Tasha talked about waiting for me to die." His face went pale. For a moment, he didn't speak. "Mom, you recorded us?" His voice was barely a whisper. I nodded. "Yes, because I finally learned what it means to protect myself." He lowered his head, speechless. Tasha turned and left first, muttering something under her breath. Devin followed, silent and defeated. When the door closed behind them, I sat down, feeling the quiet fill the room. For the first time, it wasn't a lonely silence. It was peace. I looked out at the soft morning light and smiled. My new life had begun, one not built on guilt or fear, but on freedom. Weeks passed, and peace slowly became my new normal. I started a small garden on the balcony. Nothing fancy, just a few plants and a chair where I could sit every morning with my tea. Sometimes I would think about Devin and Tasha, wondering if they had truly understood what I did. But I never reached out again. I had learned the power of distance. One morning, I received a letter. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed, formal, and signed by Devin. My heart raced as I opened it, half expecting anger, half hoping for apology. It wasn't either. He had written, "Mom, I'm sorry for everything. You were right. We got lost in what we thought we deserved. I hope you're happy. Maybe one day we can start over." For a long moment, I just sat there staring at those words. Tears filled my eyes, but not of sadness, of relief. It wasn't forgiveness that mattered anymore. It was closure. That evening, I went for a walk near the sea. The sky was painted in soft pink and gold. I watched the waves roll in and out, and it felt like life was breathing again, calm, simple, and full of quiet possibilities. I whispered to myself, "This is what peace feels like." And for the first time in years, I truly meant it. A few months later, I decided to visit the old neighborhood, not to look back, but to see how far I had come. The streets were the same, but something inside me had changed completely. I stopped in front of the cafe where I used to meet Devin when he was a teenager. The same corner table was still there, and for a moment, I could almost see him, young, smiling, and full of dreams. It made me realize that not all memories are meant to hurt. Some simply remind us of who we once were. As I walked out, I met an old neighbor, Mrs. Howard. She looked surprised to see me. "Clara, you look peaceful," she said with a soft smile. I laughed gently. I finally learned to choose peace over pain. We talked for a few minutes, and when I left, she said something that stayed with me. Sometimes letting go isn't losing. It's finally winning. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window watching the city lights shimmer like distant stars. I thought about how life had tested me, through betrayal, loneliness, and silence. But somehow, I had turned all of it into strength. I picked up my diary and wrote just one line. Freedom doesn't always come from fighting back. Sometimes it comes from walking away. That evening, as the city lights blinked awake outside my window, I whispered a quiet thank you. Not to anyone else, but to myself. For surviving. For healing. For choosing to live without resentment. My story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about rediscovery. And maybe, just maybe, that's what real freedom has always meant. Not escaping the past, but learning how to live peacefully beside it. A year later, Clara stood once again by the sea. the same place where she had once whispered her wish for peace. The waves rolled in softly, brushing against her feet as if greeting an old friend. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The air smelled of salt and calm, of endings and beginnings all at once. For so long, she had been afraid of being alone. But now loneliness felt different. It felt like freedom. She looked at the horizon where the sky met the water and smiled. "I'm proud of you," she whispered to herself. "You made it through." Her reflection danced gently across the surface, older, wiser, but finally at peace. As the sun dipped below the ocean, she turned to leave, not with sadness, but with purpose. Every step she took on the sand left a clear print, as if the world itself was acknowledging her journey. Behind her, the waves slowly washed them away, a quiet reminder that nothing stays forever. And that's what makes life beautiful. For the first time, Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to anymore. Her story had finally found its ending, not in pain, but in peace. Time has a gentle way of showing us what truly matters. Months after her quiet goodbye to the sea, Clara found herself writing again. Not letters, not diaries, but small notes filled with lessons she had learned. She shared them anonymously online under the name The Silent Heart. People from around the world began to read her words, finding comfort in her honesty. Her favorite post read, "Healing isn't about forgetting who hurt you. It's about remembering who you are without the pain." She didn't write for fame or forgiveness. She wrote because stories heal, not just those who tell them, but those who listen. One evening, she received a comment from a reader in another country. It said, "Your words helped me walk away from a life that was breaking me." "Thank you." Clara smiled softly. It was in that moment she understood. Sometimes our greatest purpose comes from the wounds we once thought would destroy us. She looked out her window once more. The world was still the same, noisy, unpredictable, alive, but she was no longer afraid of it. She had turned her pain into peace and her silence into strength. And somewhere deep inside, she knew her story might have ended, but her message had just begun. Years later, Clara's story became a quiet legend in her town, not because of drama, but because of grace. People remembered her as the woman who walked away without hate, who found strength in silence. Sometimes, the younger neighbors would see her sitting near the seaside bench, notebook in hand, writing softly as the wind played with her hair. They didn't know what she was writing, only that she always smiled while doing it. One day, a little girl from the neighborhood approached her and asked, "Miss Clara, why do you always sit here?" Clara smiled and said, "Because this is where I remember who I am." The girl tilted her head, confused but curious, and Clara added, "When you grow older, you'll learn peace isn't a place you find. It's something you create inside you." That evening, Clara closed her notebook and watched the sunset melt into gold. She had no regrets, no unfinished words, no shadows left to chase. Life had tested her, shaped her, and finally rewarded her with calm. As the sea breeze brushed against her face, she whispered one last line to herself. "The past gave me lessons. The present gave me peace. And the future is mine to write." Seasons changed, and so did the world around Clara. The once busy city now felt softer, maybe because she had learned how to move through it with peace instead of pressure. One morning, as she walked through the park, she saw families laughing, children running, and an old man feeding pigeons by the fountain. It reminded her that life, no matter how hard it gets, always finds a way to bloom again. She sat on a bench and opened a letter she had written to herself years ago, a letter filled with fear, doubt, and loneliness. As she read it, she smiled gently. Those words no longer belonged to her. She tore the letter into small pieces, letting them float into the wind. The sunlight caught them, turning every fragment into a tiny shimmer of freedom. An elderly woman sitting nearby watched her and said, "Letting go looks beautiful on you." Clara laughed softly. "It feels beautiful too," she replied. As she stood to leave, the wind carried one last piece of paper toward the sky. On it, a single line was still visible. "Someday, you'll thank yourself for surviving." And in that moment, she did. If you've ever lost something, a person, a home, or even yourself, remember Clara's story. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It comes slowly, like sunrise after a long night. Some days will be quiet, some will be heavy, but each one will take you closer to peace. Clara's journey reminds us that strength isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go. It's about choosing calm when the world expects you to break. And most of all, it's about forgiving yourself for the things you didn't know back then. So if you're watching this, maybe this is your sign to breathe, to begin again, to build a life that feels like freedom, just like Clara did. Because peace isn't found in a place or a person. It's found in you. Weeks turned into months, and Clara's life slowly took on a new rhythm. She'd wake up to sunlight streaming through her small window, brew her coffee, and smile at the quiet. No phone calls demanding anything. No footsteps echoing down her hallway. Just peace. Sometimes she'd walk to the park and sit on a bench, watching strangers laugh, kids play, and couples argue softly about silly things. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She was part of the world again, not as someone's mother or someone's widow, but as herself. Every evening, she wrote in her journal little notes about gratitude, small joys, the sound of rain, the smell of fresh bread, the feeling of being alive. And one night, she wrote a single line that defined her new life. "I used to wait for others to see me. Now I see myself. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It was peace. And that peace was something no one could ever take away from her again." Weeks after Clara had moved to her new home, Devin and Tasha sat in the quiet of their new house. The walls were empty, the rooms echoing with silence. Devin stared at the down payment papers he had thought would be his triumph, and Tasha sat with her hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. "I can't believe we treated her like that," Devin finally whispered. "All these months, we didn't see anything but what we wanted." Tasha's lips trembled. "We were so selfish. We didn't think about her feelings, her life, only ours." They both realized something heavy but undeniable. Clara hadn't just sold the condo and walked away. She had shown them the consequences of greed, of taking someone's love for granted. It wasn't anger they felt anymore. It was regret, a deep, quiet regret that settled in their hearts like a shadow they couldn't shake. In that moment, Devin and Tasha understood what Clara had always known. Respect and care cannot be demanded or forced. They are earned. And by ignoring that truth, they had lost more than a home. They had lost the chance to truly know and value the woman who had given them everything. Clara sat in her new condo, sunlight streaming through the windows. She held her notebook close, the pages filled with memories, lessons, and quiet reflections. For a long time, she had carried the weight of others' expectations, their greed, their indifference. But now, she felt light, lighter than she had in decades. She smiled softly and whispered to herself, "I survived. I healed. I chose peace over pain, freedom over fear. The world outside continued its noisy rhythm, but Clara had found her own calm within. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could shape every moment ahead. Her journey had taught her the most important truth. Life is not about what others take from you. It's about what you choose to keep for yourself. Dignity, courage, and the right to live fully. And as she closed her notebook and looked toward the horizon, she finally felt complete. Clara's story had ended. Not in revenge, not in anger, but in peace, strength, and quiet.